This story happened when I was in my mid-20s. My best friend, Arnold, had recently inherited this old 17th century 4-bedroom house from his late Uncle David. He had never met the guy. Even after his parents had passed away in a car crash, Arnold was put in an orphanage. This guy, Uncle David, did not try to get in touch. And now, after all these years. Anyways, we both drove down to this secluded property to sort out the old man's things and decide what he was going to do with it. There were mansions with massive gates on both sides of the road leading to Uncle David's house. It looked like the elite of high society lived there. We nearly missed the sign for the house. It was half hidden by overgrown shrubs. As we made our way up the driveway, the trees and vegetation got denser. After driving for a couple of minutes, the house came into view. It was once an impressive mansion, but now it looked like it needed a fresh coat of paint. It needed some work. Hell, a lot of work. There was a pond on the far side of the property. If once it had any duck or swan in it, they were long gone. The whole place looked neglected. "Dude, this place is something else," I mumbled as we got our stuff from the trunk. Arnold had mentioned his uncle was nearly a centenary and had moved into a care home years ago to be looked after. He had not expected the property to be in such bad shape. There was an eerie feeling about the place. The silence was oppressive. It felt like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I suppressed this ominous feeling, plastered a smile on my face, and gave Arnold an encouraging look, gesturing for him to lead the way into the house. The house was musty. It had not been aired for a while. There were cobwebs and dust covering all the surface. Opening the heavy drapes, the whole living room was flooded with light. The ornate antiquities basking and shining in the warmth of the sun. The house had been in Arnold's family for generations. There were pictures of Uncle David with Arnold's dad. There were pictures of his grandparents and great-grandparents. There were 2 living rooms, a massive dining room, 2 bathrooms, a humongous kitchen, a pantry the size of a small bedroom, and a utility room on the ground floor. Going up the stairs, we stared at the pictures of Arnold's ancestors, attending lavish parties, dressed up in expensive gowns and jewelry. We were lost for words. The stairs had ornate gold designs. We stared at it, wondering if it was actual gold. Arnold had mixed feelings. He was happy to finally learn about his ancestry, but how could his uncle abandon him? He grew up in an orphanage and was lucky enough that he was adopted as a teenager by a very loving family. The bedrooms were each as stunning as the other. We chose the rooms at the end of the hallway. The rooms were next to each other. Arnold did not waste time. He started shifting through the papers in his uncle's office. There were letters Aunt Helen had sent Uncle David during their youths and throughout World War II. Uncle Arnold was a war veteran, had worked in various aerospace projects, and was financially flushed. It seemed the great-grandparents were some sort of aristocrats, and Uncle David had inherited everything. Arnold was left with more questions than answers. Was his father disinherited? Could that explain why he was living a simple life and why Uncle David did not reach out? That night, we were both quite exhausted and went to bed around midnight. I woke up in the middle of the night, dazed and confused. For a moment, I could not remember where I was. Looking around at the unfamiliar room in confusion, before my sleep-addled brain cleared up, I remembered I was in Arnold's uncle's house. It took me a moment before I registered the scratching sound. It seemed to be coming from inside the room. As my eyes adapted to the darkness, I saw a small shape. It looked like someone was sitting in a corner of the room near the door, scratching on the wardrobe panel. I stared in shock at the dark shape, not daring to breathe lest she turned around. Somehow, that notion was far scarier. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I realized how cold the room was. Suddenly, there was a loud crash somewhere in the house. The shape quickly got up and ran out of the room down the corridor. I realized it was a little girl carrying something in her arms. It looked like a stuffed toy. Snapping out of my frozen state, I switched on all the lights in the room and slowly peered out of the room, nearly jumping out of my skin when I saw another head peering back at me from the room next door. Arnold whispered, "Did you hear the crash?" I nodded. We both slowly made out way down the corridor, switching on all the lights we could find, checking the rooms as we went towards the stairs. It seemed that the sound came from downstairs. I had grabbed a metal statue that looked heavy and could cause some serious damage if used as a weapon. Arnold had found a mop in the bathroom. He had removed the mop head and was following me with the stick leaning on his shoulder, ready to strike. We checked all the rooms and found the source of the crash. One of the shelves in the kitchen pantry had fallen, smashing all the jars and spilling the cans of food. While we were cleaning, I asked Arnold, "Dude, did you hear the scratching noise before the crash?" He looked at me puzzled and shook his head. No. The rest of the night was uneventful, and the next morning, I noticed the scratch marks on the wardrobe door where the girl was sitting. It was faint, looked like it was years old. It seemed like someone had attempted to apply varnish over it, but the varnish was too light and contrasted with the rest of the wardrobe. We started packing up Uncle David's clothes to be donated to a local charity. Made 2 piles, the stuff to keep and the stuff to throw away. All that time, I felt like someone was watching me. I kept feeling a chill in some places of the house. That night, I slept with the bedside lamp on and my bedroom door closed. For extra measure, I shoved a chair underneath the doorknob. Maybe it won't do much, but it would wake me up if someone tried to open the door. I checked the wardrobe and bathroom for good measure before going to bed. I woke up choking and gasping for air. The room was in complete darkness. The lamp on the bedside table was off. The room was freezing cold. I could see my breath as I breathed out in between labored breaths. Grabbing my throat, gasping for air, my eyes were drawn to the ceiling. Even in the darkness, I could see the shape of a man hovering on the ceiling above my bed. It did not move, just stayed there hovering above the bed. I can't explain it, but I felt like it was choking the life out of me. There was an intense feeling of hate emanating from it. I could feel I was about to pass out. Desperately, I reached over to the lamp and switched it on. As soon as the light was on, I felt my throat open up. Gasping for air, I dragged myself to Arnold's room. He was awake, leaning against the wall. He stared at me with sheer terror in his face. Apparently, he woke up to find a woman by the foot of his bed. He tried to get up, but was unable to move. The woman was wearing a white nightgown and a night bonnet, like those worn in the movies in the 17th or 18th century. She slowly climbed onto the bed. He could feel her claw-like nails digging into the duvet as she made her way up towards his face. When she got closer, he could see she was all bones, with shriveled skin resembling a mummy. Once they were face to face, Arnold stared into a pair of black, empty eye sockets before she released a blood-curdling scream. Arnold woke up in a pool of sweat. Was it a bad dream? He'd been awake for 10 minutes before I came into his room. We exchanged stories. He admitted that last night he had heard the scratching noises and had seen the girl run out of my room into the corridor. He had jumped out of bed when he had heard the crashing noise and rushed to the door, but paused in the doorway when he saw the girl. He thought he was seeing things. We decided to wait until sunrise to get our things and leave. Arnold did not want the house that badly to deal with the baggage it came with. He had decided to put the house up for sale. He had also inherited a good chunk of money, which he had used to renovate the house. It's been 4 years now. The house was sold 2 years ago. A newly married couple had bought it, but they did not live there for long. The house had changed hands a few times since, but no one had ever mentioned the ghostly encounters they had experienced. Arnold never got an answer to his questions, but he had resigned to never knowing why his father hadn't kept in touch with Uncle David. Whatever stories surrounded the Grenville estate, it was buried with Uncle David. I've always been a sucker for road trips. There's something about the open road, the endless possibilities, and the sense of freedom that comes with it. So, when I decided to drive cross-country to visit a friend, I was excited. I packed my old Ford with snacks, a few changes of clothes, and my favorite playlists ready for the adventure. Little did I know, this trip would be anything but typical. I had been driving for hours, the sun setting behind me as I cruised down a deserted stretch of highway. The sky turned a deep indigo, and the stars began to twinkle. I enjoyed the solitude, the rhythmic hum of the engine, and the feeling of being the only person in the world. But as the night grew darker, I started to feel uneasy. The road was empty, and I hadn't seen another car in what felt like forever. I was somewhere in the middle of the Nevada desert when I saw him, a lone figure standing on the side of the road, illuminated by the weak glow of my headlights. He had his thumb out, the universal sign for a hitchhiker. My first instinct was to drive past him, but something in his posture, the desperation, made me slow down and stop. He was a tall, gaunt man with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes. His clothes were dusty, and he looked like he hadn't had a decent meal in days. I rolled down the window and he leaned in, his face barely visible in the dim light. "Need a lift?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. "I've been walking for hours." I unlocked the passenger door, and he climbed in, sinking into the seat with a sigh of relief. I tried to make small talk, asking him where he was headed, but he was vague in his answers, only saying he was trying to get to the next town. We drove in silence for a while, the darkness outside pressing in on us. I kept glancing at him out of the corner of my eye, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. His presence seemed to suck the warmth out of the air, leaving the car feeling cold and oppressive. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to break the tension. "Call me Sam," he replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I nodded, focusing on the drive. The silence grew heavier, and I felt an inexplicable dread creeping up my spine. Suddenly, Sam spoke, his voice startling me. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked, his tone oddly detached. "I guess so," I replied, unsure of where this conversation was going. "Sometimes," he continued, "fate brings people together for a reason." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced at him, but his face was unreadable, lost in shadows. "I need to tell you something," he said after a long pause. "There's a reason I was out there, waiting for someone like you." My heart pounded in my chest. "What do you mean?" He turned to look at me, his eyes reflecting a deep, unsettling darkness. "I wasn't just waiting for a ride. I was waiting for you." Before I could react, he lunged at me, grabbing the steering wheel. The car swerved violently, and I fought to keep control. His grip was like iron, his face twisted into a mask of malevolent glee. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt on the side of the road. "Get out!" I shouted, my voice trembling with fear. Sam released the wheel and leaned back, his expression calm and eerily composed. "You don't understand," he said softly. "This is your fate." I fumbled to open the door, stumbling out of the car and backing away. Sam stayed inside, watching me with those hollow eyes. Just as I turned to run, he called out, "There's no escaping it." I didn't look back. I ran down the road, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The desert stretched endlessly before me, and the night seemed to close in, suffocating me with its darkness. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I had to get away from him. After what felt like hours, I saw lights in the distance, a small diner, a beacon of hope in the desolate landscape. I burst through the door, gasping for breath, and the few patrons inside turned to look at me with curious eyes. "Please, help me," I panted. "There's a man in my car." The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, hurried over. "Calm down, honey." "What happened?" I explained as best as I could, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. She listened, her expression growing more concerned by the minute. "Where did you leave him?" she asked. "Back on the highway, a few miles down," I replied. She exchanged a glance with the cook behind the counter, who shook his head grimly. "You better sit down," she said, guiding me to a booth. "I'll call the sheriff." As I sat there, trying to steady my nerves, I noticed an old newspaper clipping pinned to the bulletin board. It was yellowed with age, the headline barely legible: "Mysterious Disappearances Plague Highway 50." Below it was a grainy photo of a man. It looked like Sam. My blood ran cold. The waitress returned, her face pale. "Honey, the sheriff's on his way, but there's something you need to know." She pointed to the clipping. "That man you picked up, he's been dead for 20 years. They say his spirit haunts the highway, looking for people to join him." I felt the room spin, my mind struggling to comprehend what she was saying. But he was in my car. He grabbed the wheel. She nodded solemnly. "That's how it starts. You're lucky you got away." The sheriff arrived soon after and took my statement, but it was clear he believed the waitress's story. As I left the diner, he gave me a stern warning. "Stay off that highway at night. And if you see anyone hitchhiking, no matter how desperate they look, don't stop." I drove away, the fear still gripping my heart. I knew I had narrowly escaped something far worse than I could have ever imagined. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that Sam is still out there, waiting for his next victim. And every time I see a hitchhiker, I remember his words. There's no escaping it. That night changed me. I never went on another road trip, never felt the same sense of freedom on the open road. The terror of that encounter lingers, a shadow that follows me wherever I go, reminding me that some fates are inescapable. I never considered myself a believer in the supernatural. Ghost stories were always something I enjoyed in the safe confines of a campfire circle or during a late-night movie marathon, but I never expected to find myself at the center of one. That all changed on a chilly autumn evening when I decided to spend the night at my grandparents' old farmhouse. The farmhouse was a relic of the past, standing proudly in the middle of a sprawling field, surrounded by dense woods. It had been in the family for generations, and though my grandparents had long since passed away, the house remained mostly untouched, a living museum of our family's history. That evening, I arrived just before sunset. The air was crisp, and the sky was painted with shades of orange and pink. I felt a nostalgic warmth as I stepped onto the creaky wooden porch and unlocked the front door. The familiar scent of aged wood and faint lavender greeted me, a reminder of the countless summers spent there as a child. I spent the first couple of hours exploring the house, reminiscing about old memories. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I decided to make a cup of tea and settle down with a book in the living room. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards, which I attributed to the house settling. Around 10 p.m., I felt a sudden chill in the air. I glanced at the fireplace, noting that the flames had died down. As I got up to add more wood, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. In the reflection of the large, ornate mirror above the fireplace, I saw a shadow move swiftly across the room. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to shake off the unease. I told myself it was just a trick of the light and resumed my task. As I turned back towards the fireplace, I felt a distinct presence behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering slightly. There was no response, only the oppressive silence of the house. Determined not to let my imagination get the best of me, I returned to my book. But the feeling of being watched persisted. Every so often, I would hear faint, indistinct whispers, almost like a conversation just out of earshot. I tried to ignore them, but my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I made my way upstairs to the attic. The door was slightly ajar, which struck me as odd since I distinctly remembered closing it earlier. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The attic was filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and forgotten relics of the past. As I scanned the room with my flashlight, something caught my eye, a dusty, antique rocking chair in the far corner, gently swaying back and forth. I approached the chair cautiously, my flashlight beam trembling. As I drew nearer, the temperature seemed to drop even further. I reached out to touch the chair, half expecting my hand to pass through it. But it was solid, cold to the touch. Suddenly, the door to the attic slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. I was plunged into darkness, my flashlight flickering and then going out completely. Panic set in as I fumbled to turn it back on. When I finally did, I was met with the sight of a figure standing in the doorway. It was a man this time, dressed in tattered old-fashioned clothes, his face twisted into a grotesque grin. His eyes were dark, hollow pits, and he seemed to be staring right into my soul. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. The man began to move towards me, his steps slow and deliberate. As he approached, I could feel an overwhelming sense of malevolence emanating from him. He stopped just a few feet away, his grin widening unnaturally. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of hell, he spoke. "You're not welcome here." His words sent a chill down my spine. Before I could respond, he lunged at me, his hands outstretched. I stumbled back, tripping over a box and falling to the floor. The flashlight rolled away, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. Desperate to escape, I ran towards the door, but it wouldn't budge. The man was now inches away, his face contorted with rage. I could feel his cold breath on my skin, and a sense of hopelessness washed over me. Just as he reached out to grab me, the door suddenly flew open, and I tumbled out of the attic, crashing down the stairs. I landed in a heap at the bottom, dazed and disoriented. The house was now filled with an oppressive silence, broken only by my ragged breathing. I glanced up the stairs, expecting to see the man coming after me, but there was nothing. The attic door was closed, and the malevolent presence seemed to have vanished. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my things and fled the house, not stopping until I was safely in my car, the engine roaring to life. As I sped away from the farmhouse, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man standing in the doorway. But the house stood silent and empty, a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky. I never returned to that farmhouse, and I've never been able to shake the feeling of dread that washed over me that night. Whatever evil resided there, it had made it clear that I was not welcome. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or heard, but one thing is certain: I will never forget the terrifying encounter that made me a believer in the supernatural. I always thought hazing rituals were just stupid pranks meant to scare the new kids. When my friends dared me to spend the night in the old Oakwood cemetery, I laughed it off. It was the final test to join their club, and as the new kid in town, I was eager to fit in. They swore the cemetery was haunted, but I figured it was all just stories. How wrong I was. It was a chilly October night, the kind where the wind howls through the trees and leaves rustle like whispers of the dead. I packed my sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a couple of snacks, and set off to meet my friends at the cemetery gates. They were already there, grinning and making jokes, their faces lit by the glow of their flashlights. "All right, Alex," said Jake, the ringleader of our group. "You gotta stay here until dawn. No running away, no chickening out." I rolled my eyes and gave a mock salute. "Piece of cake," I said, trying to mask my nerves. As the gates creaked open, an icy wind blew through, making the hair on my arms stand up. The cemetery was huge, with ancient tombstones and mausoleums casting long, eerie shadows in the moonlight. The guys patted me on the back, wished me luck, and promised to return at sunrise. Then they left, their laughter fading into the distance. I made my way to the center of the cemetery, where an old, gnarled oak tree stood sentinel. I unrolled my sleeping bag at its base and sat down, switching on my flashlight. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves. I tried to read a book to pass the time, but my eyes kept drifting to the shadows. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. I froze, straining to hear. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. It was a voice, distant and faint, calling my name. "Alex." My heart pounded in my chest. I swept the beam of my flashlight around, but saw nothing. Just as I convinced myself it was my imagination, the voice came again, louder, more insistent. "Alex, come here." I stood up, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The voice seemed to be coming from deeper within the cemetery. Against my better judgment, I followed it, weaving through the tombstones. The air grew colder, and the whispers more urgent. I found myself standing in front of an old mausoleum, its iron gate rusted and hanging ajar. The voice seemed to be coming from inside. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the gate open with a loud creak and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of decay and damp stone. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows of ancient coffins. At the far end of the mausoleum, I saw a figure, a woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, her hair matted and eyes hollow. "Alex," she whispered, her voice echoing off the walls. "Help me." I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. She reached out a bony hand, her eyes pleading. I took a step back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Please," she begged. "Help me." Before I could react, she lunged at me, her face twisted in a mask of rage. Her hand passed through me, but I felt an icy chill sear my skin. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight. The mausoleum was filled with an otherworldly wail, a chorus of voices crying out in torment. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. The shadows seemed to reach out for me, clawing at my clothes, pulling me back. I burst out of the mausoleum, gasping for air. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more frantic. I didn't stop running until I reached my sleeping bag, but even there, I felt their presence, lurking in the darkness. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and panic. I huddled in my sleeping bag, too terrified to move. The whispers never ceased, and the cold, accusing eyes of the ghostly woman haunted me. When the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, my friends returned. They found me pale and trembling, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. I tried to tell them what happened, but they just laughed, thinking it was all a part of the hazing ritual. I never spoke of that night again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of that mausoleum. I left town soon after, unable to bear the weight of those whispers and the haunting gaze of the woman in white. Years later, I still wake up in a cold sweat, hearing my name called out in the dead of night. No matter where I go, I can never escape the terror that gripped me that night in Oakwood Cemetery. Camping trips were always our thing. Every summer, my friends and I would head out into the wilderness for a week of hiking, fishing, and the occasional ghost story around the campfire. This year was no different, except it would be a trip we'd never forget. We chose a remote spot deep in the Blackwood Forest, a place renowned for its beauty and, as some locals whispered, its dark history. We shrugged off the warnings, eager for an adventure. There were 5 of us: Jake, the fearless leader; Emma, always the voice of reason; Tom, the jokester; Sarah, with her unshakable curiosity; and me, the reluctant follower. The first couple of days were perfect. We set up our tents, explored the nearby trails, and spent our evenings roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. On the 3rd night, however, things took a sinister turn. It started with Tom. He had wandered off to gather more firewood as the sun was setting. When he didn't return after an hour, we began to worry. Jake and I grabbed our flashlights and set out to find him, calling his name into the encroaching darkness. After what felt like an eternity, we found him standing at the edge of a small clearing, staring at something we couldn't see. "Tom, what are you doing?" Jake asked, his voice edged with concern. Tom turned to us slowly, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "I saw something," he whispered. "A woman, she was just standing there, staring at me." We tried to brush it off as Tom playing one of his pranks, but the fear in his eyes was real. We led him back to camp, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over us. That night, as we sat around the fire, Tom recounted his encounter in detail. She was wearing this old-fashioned dress, like something out of the 19th century. And her eyes, they were just black pits. Emma tried to reason it away. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or you were just seeing things because it was getting dark. Tom shook his head. "No, it was real." And she whispered something to me. We all leaned in, the fire crackling in the tense silence. She said, "Leave this place or you'll never leave." We laughed nervously, but the mood was tense. We decided to call it a night and retreated to our tents. I had trouble sleeping, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig outside sending my heart racing. Just as I was starting to drift off, I sat up, listening intently. The sound grew louder, a sorrowful cry that seemed to echo through the forest. I unzipped my tent, and stepped outside, finding the others already gathered by the fire, their faces pale. "You hear it too?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. We nodded, looking around in fear. The wailing continued, growing closer and more intense. Then, from the darkness, she emerged, the woman Tom had described. She floated just beyond the light of the fire, her hollow eyes fixed on us.
"Leave this place,
She whispered, her voice carrying on the wind.
or you will never leave."
Jake, ever the brave one, stepped forward. "Who are you? What do you want?" The ghostly figure pointed a bony finger at him.
"You are trespassing on sacred ground. Leave now or suffer the consequences."
Panic set in. We grabbed our things, hastily packing up as the apparition watched. As we made our way to the trail, the forest seemed to come alive with sinister sounds, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and faint whispers all around us. We stumbled through the dark, guided only by our flashlights and the sheer terror driving us forward. The haunting wail followed us, growing louder and more desperate. We could feel her presence behind us, urging us to leave faster. After what felt like hours, we burst out of the forest and into the safety of our cars. We didn't stop until we were miles away, the terror slowly subsiding as we reached civilization. None of us spoke much on the drive back. The experience had shaken us to our core. We knew we had encountered something beyond our understanding, something that would haunt our memories forever. We never went back to Blackwood Forest. Our camping trips became a thing of the past, each of us too afraid to risk another encounter with the unknown. Even now, years later, I can still hear her wailing in my dreams, a chilling reminder of the night we dared to trespass on sacred ground and were terrorized by a restless spirit.